His name was Derek, 43 years old. Retired electrician, lived outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had a generator, fuel, 6 months of freeze-dried food stacked neatly in a climate-controlled room. He had a rifle, a good one, and 2,000 rounds of ammunition. He had a plan. When the grid went down on a Tuesday evening in January, Derek did everything right. He fired up the generator. He locked the doors. He told his wife and 2 daughters to stay calm. By Thursday morning, Derek was dead. Not from a gunfight, not from a raider, not from anything he had ever prepared for. He died from a blood clot, a deep vein thrombosis that traveled to his lungs, brought on by stress, by sitting still too long, by the silent physiological war that begins the moment your body understands, on some primal level, that the world outside has changed. His wife found him in the kitchen at 4 a.m., still holding a flashlight. He had a plan for everything, except the thing that actually killed him. I've spent a long time studying the moment civilizations fracture, not the movies, not the fiction. The real events, the documented hours. The testimony of people who lived inside the collapse and had to rebuild something from the ruins. I call myself a trash panda for a reason. A raccoon doesn't wait for the supermarket to restock. It learns the rhythms of the dumpster. It moves at night. It eats what others dismiss as worthless. It survives not because it is the strongest animal, but because it is the most adaptive one. And if you've been studying collapse the way I have, quietly, carefully, in the spaces between comfortable assumptions, you start to realize something deeply uncomfortable. Most of what the prepper community teaches you to fear is wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong enough to get you killed. Today, I want to walk you through the first 24 hours of grid failure. Not the Hollywood version, the real one. 7 phases. 7 truths. And by the time we reach the last one, I want you to sit with it for a moment before you move on. Because it's the one most people refuse to hear. Here's what happens in the first 2 hours of a grid failure that most people get catastrophically wrong. Nothing happens. Silence. A neighborhood goes dark, and the first collective response, almost universally, across every documented collapse, is assumption. People assume it's temporary. They assume someone is already fixing it. They assume the lights will be back by morning. This is not stupidity. This is psychology. The human mind has a mechanism called normalcy bias. It is the cognitive tendency to underestimate the likelihood and impact of a disaster, even as it is unfolding around you. It is the reason that during the 2003 Northeast blackout, which knocked out power to 55 million people across the US and Canada, most people's first response was to call their electric company and wait. It is the reason that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, ordinary Russian citizens in Moscow continued going to work in state offices that had not paid salaries in months. They just kept showing up, because the alternative, accepting that the structure had failed, was cognitively unbearable. The first 2 hours are not violent. They are quiet. And that quietness is the most dangerous thing in the world. Because while you are waiting, the clock is already running. Diabetics are counting insulin doses. People on cardiac medication are doing math they'd rather not do. Hospital backup generators, most rated for 72 to 96 hours, are already burning through their reserves. The trash panda lesson here is simple. The moment the lights go out, assume they are not coming back. Not forever, but long enough to matter. Because your response in the first 2 hours determines whether you are ahead of the curve or behind it for the rest of the event. Let me ask you something. When you think about grid failure, what do you worry about first? Most people say food. Some people say security. Almost nobody says water. And that is one of the most historically consistent mistakes in every documented collapse. Here is what they don't tell you in most survival content. Municipal water systems are electrically dependent. The pumps that move water through your pipes, the ones that create the pressure that allows you to turn on a tap, run on electricity. When the grid fails, those pumps keep running on backup power for a period of time. That window varies by municipality. Some cities have 6 hours of backup pump capacity. Some have 48. Most people have absolutely no idea which category their city falls into. During Hurricane Katrina in 2005, water pressure in large sections of New Orleans failed within hours of the storm's impact. Not because the pipes were broken, because the pumps stopped. What followed was not a thirst problem. It was a hygiene collapse. No water to flush toilets, no water to wash hands, no water to clean wounds. The waterborne illness wave that rolled through displaced populations in the days that followed killed and sickened people who had survived the storm itself. In Sarajevo, during the 1992 to 1996 siege, the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare, civilians spent years carrying water from the Miljaska River in bottles and containers, under sniper fire. Years. Not days. Years. The trash panda rule for water is this. The moment the grid fails, fill every container you own. Your bathtubs, your pots, your bottles. Your water BOB if you have one. Do it immediately. Not because you are sure you'll need it, but because you cannot undo the decision not to. Water is not a 3-day problem. It is an hour 1 problem. 6 hours in. The illusion of calm begins to fracture. People who have been waiting for the lights to return are now starting to move. They're going to the gas station, the grocery store, the ATM, and here's where history has a very specific, very consistent pattern. It is not the dangerous people who cause the first wave of social breakdown. It is the normal ones. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in 2012, fistfights erupted at gas stations within 24 hours. People who had lived peacefully as neighbors for decades, who had barbecued together, whose children had played together, turned on each other over a spot in a fuel line. Not because they were bad people, because they were afraid. And fear, when mixed with scarcity, removes the social veneer with extraordinary speed. In Argentina's 2001 economic collapse, supermarkets were looted within hours, not by criminal networks, by ordinary families, teachers, bank clerks, people who had never stolen anything in their lives. This is the phase where the prepper fantasy of the lone defender protecting his compound starts to collapse under its own weight. Because here is what the history shows. The people most likely to take from you in the first 24 hours are not strangers. They are the people who know you have something. Your neighbor who noticed the generator in your garage. The person at church who knew about your food storage. The extended family member who always thought you were a little paranoid, but now remembers exactly what you said you were prepared for. The trash panda has no illusions about this. A raccoon survives not by advertising what it has found, but by moving quietly, eating in the dark, and never, ever letting the larger animals see what it's carrying. Operational security is not paranoia. It is the single most historically validated survival behavior across every documented collapse. Visual. A pharmacy. Locked gate. A small crowd outside. This is the phase that almost nobody talks about. And it is, statistically, the phase that kills the most people in the first 72 hours of any serious infrastructure failure. Not violence, not starvation, not dehydration, medical dependency. In the United States alone, approximately 37 million people are diabetic. Roughly a third of them are insulin dependent. Insulin, once opened, has a limited window of viability, and that window shrinks dramatically without refrigeration. Add to that the roughly 6 million Americans on blood thinners, the millions on anti-seizure medication, the cardiac patients, the dialysis patients, a population that requires machine-assisted kidney function 3 times per week, or they begin to die. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria in 2017, the island's medical infrastructure collapsed within days. Dialysis centers lost power, insulin supplies spoiled. People who had survived the storm, people who had done everything right, began dying in the second and third week from entirely preventable medical failures. In the Bosnian siege, survivors report that the first truly devastating losses in their neighborhoods were not combat casualties. They were the elderly diabetics, the heart patients, the people whose survival had always depended on a supply chain that no longer existed. I want to say this clearly because the survival community often dances around it. If you or someone in your household has a chronic medical condition that requires electricity, refrigeration, or a consistent pharmaceutical supply, that condition is your single greatest survival variable, more than your food, more than your weapons, more than your water supply. And most people have never had a serious, honest conversation about what their plan actually is. The trash panda does not romanticize this. It sits with the uncomfortable reality. And then it makes a plan. Visual. A phone screen, no signal. A spinning loading icon that never resolves, 14 hours in. Your phone still works, for now. But the cell towers are running on battery backup. Most of them carry between 4 and 8 hours of reserve power. Some have generators, many do not. The internet may still be partially accessible through certain infrastructure, or it may be completely dark. And this creates something that is psychologically, almost as destabilizing as the physical deprivation. An information vacuum. You do not know if this is a regional outage or a national one. You do not know if it is accidental or deliberate. You do not know if it will last 12 hours or 12 months. And that uncertainty, that specific, gnawing, unresolvable uncertainty, is one of the most psychologically corrosive forces in any collapse scenario. In 2011, when Muammar Gaddafi's government began cutting internet and cellular communications in Libya, survivors described the experience as more terrifying than the physical danger, because you could process a physical threat. You could respond to it. You cannot respond to a silence. In the Syrian civil war, entire neighborhoods survived the first weeks not because they were the best armed or the best supplied, but because they had the best information networks. Communities that maintained reliable communication, even through runners, even through handwritten notes, consistently outperformed those that didn't in terms of decision-making and ultimately survival rates. Information is a survival resource. Treat it like one. A hand-crank emergency radio is not a luxury. It is a primary intelligence tool. A pre-established communication plan with people you trust, agreed upon before the event, not improvised during it, is not a paranoid fantasy. It is the difference between knowing you are in a 48-hour regional outage and making sound decisions versus assuming the worst, panicking and making the kind of irreversible choices that 14-hour adrenaline fatigue produces. The trash panda moves through the dark because it has learned the landscape before the lights went out. It knows where things are. It knows which way the wind is blowing. The time to map your information network is right now. Not then. Phase 2, hours 18 through 22. The psychology of the group, visual, a community center. People gathered. A man standing on a table, speaking too loudly. By hour 18, communities begin to self-organize. This is, in many ways, the most important and the most underestimated dynamic of the first 24 hours. Because the research on collapse is unambiguous on this point. Community cohesion is the single most powerful predictor of survival outcomes in infrastructure failure events. More than individual preparedness, more than resources, more than weapons. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake in Japan, the neighborhoods that recovered fastest were not the ones with the most government aid. They were the ones with the strongest pre-existing social bonds, neighbors who knew each other, communities that had established networks of mutual obligation before the disaster. After the Soviet collapse, it was not the rugged individualists who navigated the chaos best. It was people embedded in extended networks of reciprocal exchange, informal economies of trust and shared resource that predated the crisis. After Hurricane Katrina, the most devastating outcomes occurred not in the poorest neighborhoods, but in the most socially fragmented ones. Places where people had stopped knowing their neighbors, where the social fabric had thinned to nothing before the wind arrived. But here's the dark side of this truth. And this is the part most survival content skips. Community self-organization in the first 24 hours is highly volatile. The man standing on the table in the community center, loud, confident, apparently certain, will attract followers, not because he is right, but because in an information vacuum, confidence mimics competence. History is full of collapses that were worsened significantly by the wrong person taking charge in the first critical hours. The trash panda watches this dynamic with particular attention. It does not rush to the loudest voice. It observes who is actually calm. It identifies who is problem-solving versus who is performing. It watches the hands, what they're doing, not what the mouth is saying. The leader you want in a collapse is almost never the one who announces himself first. Find the quiet people who have already started doing useful things. Phase 1, hour 23. The moment everything shifts, visual, a darkened house. A single candle in the window. The street outside empty. Music drops to near silence. We are near the end of the first 24 hours. And I want to talk about something that almost no survival channel will say directly, because it makes people uncomfortable. The first 24 hours of a grid failure does not primarily test your gear. It does not test your food supply. It does not test your weapons. It tests who you are. In Sarajevo, survivors of the siege describe a specific psychological moment, a threshold that every person eventually crossed. The moment you stopped waiting for things to return to normal and started accepting that this was normal now, that adaptation was not optional. That the person you were before was going to have to change, or you were going to spend all of your energy grieving a version of your life that no longer existed. The people who crossed that threshold fastest, the ones who adapted their identity along with their behavior, were consistently the ones who endured best. Not because they were harder, but because they stopped spending cognitive resources on denial. The psychological research on disaster survivors is striking in its consistency. The trait that correlates most strongly with long-term survival is not physical strength. It is not aggression. It is not even prior preparation. It is what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to update your mental model of reality in real time, without collapsing under the weight of what that update costs you. Derek, the electrician outside Tulsa, the man from the beginning of this video, had a plan. His plan was built around a specific picture of what collapse would look like, a specific enemy, a specific threat. And when the actual threat arrived, invisible, physiological, utterly mundane, he did not recognize it. Not because he was stupid, but because the brain under stress seeks confirmation of its existing model. The most dangerous survival mistake is not a lack of preparation. It is a preparation so rigid, so confident, so detailed in its imagination of one specific future that it becomes blind to all the others. The rule they don't teach: visual, slow zoom on a darkened window. A single figure moving outside quietly. Narrator's voice drops slightly. I want to leave you with a rule. It is not a comfortable one. I call it the Trash Panda Protocol. And it goes like this. Survive your assumptions before you try to survive the collapse. Every plan you have made, go through it. Right now. Not during the event. And for each element of that plan, ask yourself one question. What assumption is this built on? The generator plan assumes you have fuel. The fuel plan assumes you can move safely to acquire it. The community plan assumes your community will behave rationally. The medical plan assumes the people you're planning for stay healthy. The security plan assumes the threat comes from the direction you're expecting. History does not collapse in the shape of your expectations. It collapses in the shape it chooses. The raccoon does not survive because it is big. It does not survive because it is fast. It does not survive because it fights well. It survives because it has no attachment to how things are supposed to work. It sees what is actually there. It moves through the actual darkness, not the darkness it imagined. And it carries only what it can actually use. Visual. Aerial shot of a city at night. Lights on. For now. The grid is still on right now. That is a gift. And most people treat it like a guarantee. The first 24 hours will not care about your gear list. It will not care about your caliber selection. It will not care about your stash. It will care about your psychology, your flexibility, your relationships, your medical reality, your ability to act before the crowd. Derek had everything on the list. He was missing the one thing that wasn't on it. Study the real collapses. Sarajevo, Katrina, Argentina, the Soviet dissolution, Syria, not for horror, but for data. Because in the spaces between what those people expected and what actually happened, that is where the real curriculum lives. That is where the Trash Panda reads. Take care of yourselves out there. And pay attention. The ones who survived weren't the most prepared. They were the most honest about what they didn't know. Fade to black, end card, subscribe. No fluff, just collapse history and what it actually means.